The 11th of January 1944, somewhere above the thick winter haze of Oschersleben, Germany, the sky carried a strange stillness, one of those deceptive moments when the cold air seemed carved from glass and the horizon looked too quiet for a war this violent. The 401st Bomb Group pushed eastward in disciplined formation, four engine silhouettes shimmering in the pale sun, their contrails cutting long white scars across a blue sheet that felt both serene and fatal. Below them, the fields of Saxony rolled beneath a thin layer of frost, untouched by the fires waiting to ignite. At the edge of the formation, a lone P-51 Mustang held station, a single speck guarding a fleet of giants. Lieutenant James Howard sat behind the high-backed seat of his Mustang, fingers steady on the throttle, eyes tracking every flicker in the sky. His aircraft, OPP-Tunity, was lighter than usual, carrying just enough ammunition for a standard escort mission and enough fuel to complete the return leg if nothing went wrong. But Howard knew that nothing on days like this stayed normal for long. The bomber's engines droned with the deep, rhythmic confidence of massed horsepower, a sound that usually meant safety. Yet today the tone was slightly different, almost uneasy. Fragments of radio chatter drifted between Howard's headphones, navigators confirming headings, gunners reporting clear skies, formation leaders repeating the same phrase every bomber crew understood, enemy fighters likely forming ahead. Howard's gaze moved across the sky with the sharp, practiced reflex of a man who had seen combat in two different theaters. He had fought the Japanese over Burma years earlier, and the lessons he carried from that harsh front clung to him even now: the importance of altitude, the danger of sun-angle attacks, the subtle glints of metal that betrayed motion before shape. He had learned to trust his instincts more than any instrument panel. The sun was low and pale, hanging just above the distant haze like an old lantern giving off a dying light. It made the sky difficult to read, a perfect backdrop for German interceptors. At these heights, the temperature inside the cockpit dropped so quickly that the metal frame seemed to contract, making every vibration from the Merlin engine resonate through the seat. Frost formed along the edges of the canopy, shifting slightly whenever Howard exhaled. Altitude had its own sound. Higher up, the wind thinned until it whispered around the fuselage, the Mustang slicing through the air with a precision only laminar flow wings could provide. Howard listened to the engine's note, waiting for any irregularity. The deep, full-chested roar of the Rolls-Royce built power plant was a comfort, a steady heartbeat that promised speed if he needed it. Then, almost too distant to register, a small scattering of movement flickered near the horizon. First one, then several more. Glints of reflected light that didn't match the formation's geometry. They dipped, vanished, then reappeared. Howard straightened slightly, adjusting the trim without conscious thought. The haze distorted shapes, turning their silhouettes into faint shadows that moved in disciplined arcs. The contrails began multiplying in the distance. Thin, curling streams, too many, too fast. The German fighters weren't probing, they were massing. The bombers flew onward, unaware that a storm was building ahead. Inside each B-17, crews tightened their oxygen masks, checked their turrets, and waited for gunners' instincts to sharpen. They depended entirely on their escorts. Today they had only one. Howard eased his Mustang forward, positioning himself slightly above and ahead of the bomber boxes. His eyes narrowed as the first shapes came into focus. Sharp, angular wings, climbing in aggressive sweeps. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, dozens of them, spread in layered waves designed to break an escort screen. But on this front, there was no screen. Just a single pilot, against an oncoming force. The radio cracked with a report from one of the bomber leaders. Fighters at 3 o'clock. Multiple. Closing fast. Howard didn't answer. He didn't need to. His Mustang was already moving. He pushed the throttle forward, letting the Merlin rise into a deep growl that vibrated through the canopy. The nose dipped slightly as the aircraft accelerated, cold air slamming against the windscreen. Sun glare spilled across the cockpit, filling the edges with a hard white sheen. The German formation expanded, revealing its structure: high cover fighters, mid-level attackers, and a low group angling for head-on passes. It was a measured, coordinated assault, the kind meant to tear bombers apart with absolute efficiency. From the bomber crew's perspective, the sky began to shift in color. The serene blue turned tense, shadowed by approaching motion. One waist gunner watched through his plexiglass blister as the lone Mustang nosed upward, its silhouette sharp and defiant. Howard could feel the moment tightening, not fear, just the cold pressure of what had to be done. He was alone, outnumbered beyond reason, low on fuel, limited on ammunition. But the bombers behind him carried 10 men each, 30 aircraft, 300 lives, all depending on a single fighter. The first German fighters broke formation and dove toward the bombers, their engines howling through the thin air. Howard rolled the Mustang into the sun. The storm was beginning. The path that brought James Howard to this solitary stretch of freezing sky had begun long before the German fighters appeared, shaped by 2 continents, 2 wars, and a strange sequence of chances that set him apart from most American pilots. By the time he reached this January mission over Oschersleben, Howard had already lived more than one combat life. What happened today wasn't luck or boldness. It was the inevitable intersection of experience, design, and necessity. Years earlier, Howard had flown with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers in Burma, where engagements were fast, low, and brutally unforgiving. There, in the haze-filled heat over Rangoon, he learned the habits that could not be taught in classroom settings: how to anticipate energy states in a furball, how to strike with short bursts instead of wasteful streams, and how to maneuver when outnumbered by aggressive, coordinated opponents. The air war in Asia had shaped his instincts around survival under pressure, forcing a level of personal autonomy most pilots never developed. That hardened instinct, refined under desperate circumstances, became a quiet edge he carried home when he later joined the U.S. Army Air Forces. The war in Europe, however, was a different machine entirely. The skies over Germany were a chessboard of precise formations and enormous stakes. Heavy bombers crossed vast distances with careful discipline, their survival dependent on oxygen systems, precision navigation, and mutual support. The escort fighters that protected them flew missions far longer than any fighter in previous wars. Each combat minute was preceded by hours of strain, fuel conservation, engine management, and an unbroken mental scan of the sky. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had suffered staggering losses from German defensive fighters. B-17 formations had been mauled on deep penetration missions, and daylight bombing doctrine, already a point of Allied contention, was under severe threat. Escort fighters were needed to preserve the air campaign, but only the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang made continuous cover possible. When the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England with their new Mustangs, the 8th Air Force immediately recognized their potential. The aircraft combined range, speed, and altitude performance with remarkable maneuverability. A well-flown Mustang could climb into a fight, break off, reposition, and strike again before German fighters could match its speed envelope. It was a machine built for initiative, a fighter that rewarded pilots who acted independently with precision and aggression. And among those pilots, James Howard stood out. He wasn't loud, nor was he the type to boast. He carried himself with the quiet calm of someone who had survived both isolation and chaos. In briefings, he rarely spoke unless asked, but when he did, his observations were exact, always centered on geometry, energy, and timing. He understood how enemies would position themselves, how they would commit to an attack, and what opportunities would appear once they did. He didn't chase emotion. He chased advantage. That morning, when Howard climbed into his P-51B at RAF Boxted, nothing hinted at the extraordinary moment ahead. Crew chiefs cinched the straps, ran final checks, and watched the Mustang roll forward into the frost-lined airfield. The sky was already pale, the ground crew's breath hanging in slow-moving clouds as engines across the base warmed to life. The briefing had emphasized Oschersleben as the primary target, a complex of aircraft component factories critical to German fighter production. Everyone expected resistance. But no one predicted the full concentration of German fighters that would mass to meet the approaching bombers. The Luftwaffe had been battered by attrition, but its defensive structure in central Germany remained formidable. Fighter Gruppen stationed at Salzwedel, Wernigerode, Quedlinburg, Halberstadt, and other fields could scramble quickly to intercept bomber streams. Their tactics had evolved into a layered defense, vertical separation to force escorts to chase, multi-axis attacks to confuse gunners, and disciplined breaks to avoid sustained fire from the B-17S. FW-190S typically performed high-speed, head-on passes. BF-109S approached from oblique angles to pick off stragglers. Specialized groups coordinated with flak batteries to push bombers into predictable corridors. This was the environment Howard flew into, an ecosystem built to overwhelm escorts, not be challenged by a single aircraft. The 401st Bomb Group maintained formation despite the cold turbulence of the upper air. Their mission depended on cohesion. Inside the lead bomber, the navigator charted every minor drift, aware that deviation could unravel the entire strike plan. Gunners scanned the horizon, each man responsible for a specific sector, yet all united by one shared expectation, that the escort fighters would intercept threats before they reached the bomber boxes. But on this mission, timing fractured. As the bomber stream advanced near the Harz Mountains, portions of the escort cover became separated due to weather, radio miscommunication, and staggered climbs. The Mustangs assigned to the upper and side elements drifted too far west. Some P-38s Hess had turned back with mechanical issues. The 354th's own squadrons were dispersed, leaving gaps in the coverage. Howard's flight, only a handful of Mustangs, became isolated. Then, as altitude and distance stretched the formation further, even that handful disappeared into cloud and haze. In minutes, he was completely alone. Below, the bombers held formation, unaware that fate had just narrowed their shield to a single fighter. Ahead, German interceptors were forming, a massed defensive response unlike anything the bomber crewmen had faced. Reconnaissance later estimated 30 to 35 fighters moving into attack position, likely from Jagdgeschwader 11 and supporting elements. They rose aggressively, climbing into the altitude band where bomber formations struggled to maintain their advantage. The air war over Germany had entered a phase where every moment, every mile, every minute of oxygen, every drop of fuel, carried consequences. Howard pushed his Mustang forward, the engine straining in the cold air. He understood exactly what was coming. The geometry was too clear, the formation too dense, the speed of their climb too purposeful. The German fighters weren't just intercepting, they were preparing to strike with everything they had. And somewhere behind him, hundreds of bomber crewmen would soon be trapped under the full force of that assault, unless someone intervened. Howard had no escort wing to coordinate with, no reinforcements in sight, fuel limits that demanded restraint, ammunition that required precision. Yet the moment demanded something else entirely. He was the only fighter between 30 German interceptors and the bomber stream they were hunting. The air around him was thinning. The stakes were tightening. The horizon was filling with movement. Everything in his life to this point, Burma, training, instinct, calm, narrowed to this single stretch of frozen sky. He eased his throttle forward. The world was about to collide. The first attack did not come as a sudden rush, but as a slow, tightening shift in the sky, subtle motions becoming organized, scattered glints converging into purposeful geometry. To the bomber crews, the German fighters looked like metallic flecks gliding along the edge of visibility. To James Howard, they were precise, coordinated threats aligning for a decisive strike. The leading wave of FW-190S approached, in a shallow descent, using the sun's pale glow as partial concealment. Their radial engines gleamed for a moment as they rolled into formation, wide, aggressive wings cutting downward through the frozen air. Behind them, a secondary element of Balth 109S angled for altitude, climbing faster than the rest to hold the high position that would allow them to dive with unstoppable energy. This layered structure was the signature of an experienced Luftwaffe assault group. Howard saw the timing. The German fighters were not rushing. They were setting up a synchronized pattern of attacks that would strike the bombers from multiple axes in timed waves, The FW-190S would begin with high-speed slashing attacks, forcing the Bell 17 to disperse their defensive fire. The 109S would then swoop in, targeting isolated bombers or those forced out of position. If the German pilots reached the bomber formation unchallenged, the consequences would be catastrophic. Howard eased the Mustang into a gentle climb, letting the nose angle upward, just enough to shift his energy state without alarming the attackers. He remained a single speck against the horizon, either unnoticed or dismissed. The Germans likely assumed the escort cover was scattered, but not absent. In deep penetration missions, Mustangs rarely operated alone. The lead FW-190 banked left, angling toward the bomber formation. That was the moment Howard moved. He rolled the Mustang sharply, cutting across the path of the diving fighters with a burst of speed that disrupted the geometry of their approach. It was not an attack, it was an interposition. A single fighter forcing a formation of interceptors to reconsider their vector. One FW-190 committed anyway, diving in for a firing pass on the nearest bomber. Howard pulled the stick into his gut, the Mustang arcing upward in a tight climbing turn that used every advantage of its laminar flow wings. The Merlin engine roared, the airframe straining under the sudden load. Frost cracked along the edges of the canopy as the Mustang surged into the path of the German fighter. A short burst from Howard's guns flared in the cold sky, precise, controlled. Tracer rounds stitched a line across the FW-190's engine cowling. At this altitude, a single hit could be catastrophic. Metal fragments sprayed into the slipstream. The German aircraft lurched, smoke venting from the right side of the engine. It spiraled downward, trailing a thin black column that vanished quickly against the haze. The effect on the German formation was immediate. Howard had not merely shot down a fighter, he had announced his presence. The second wave of FW-190S broke formation, turning toward the lone Mustang. Their deflection angles tightened. Howard's altitude advantage evaporated as the fighters closed from multiple directions. The bomber crews watched from above, stunned by the sight of a single escort charging directly into a cluster of enemy fighters. The next attack came from behind. A Bell 109 dove sharply, its pilot attempting to catch Howard in a moment of recovery after his initial strike. But Howard had anticipated it. He snapped the Mustang into a vertical roll, the aircraft corkscrewing upward as tracers swept past the tail. The German pilot overshot, the momentum of his dive carrying him forward, a fatal commitment. Howard reversed the roll and dropped onto the Bell 109's 6 o'clock position. The Mustang's guns erupted again, this time in a tighter burst. A wing root shuddered on the German fighter. Then the aircraft pitched forward, trailing vapor as it plunged into the lower haze. 2 fighters neutralized. 28 to go. The bomber gunners began calling out sightings over the intercom, voices crackling in disbelief. The Mustangs engaging them alone. He's holding them off. Howard did not hear them. His world had narrowed to engine roar, geometry, and instinct. Every second mattered. Fuel was already decreasing faster than he preferred. Ammunition expenditure had to remain controlled. Each maneuver had to conserve energy, while still disrupting the German attack patterns. The Luftwaffe pilots adjusted quickly. The next wave split into a pincer. 2 FW-190S attempting to bracket Howard from opposite directions, while a third climbed to dive directly onto the bomber formation. Howard saw the high fighter's intent and made his decision in a heartbeat. He chose the bomber stream over his own safety. He dove into the climbing path of the FW-190, forcing an early merge. The German pilot hesitated, just long enough for Howard to slip beneath him, rise into a shallow climb, and fire a diagonal burst that clipped the underside of the fighter's wing. The impact was small but destabilizing. The FW-190 flipped unexpectedly and lost its firing angle on the bombers. It recovered seconds later but too far away to threaten the formation. Howard had stopped a third attack, without a clean kill, but with full tactical effect. The other 2 FW-190s converged simultaneously. Howard's only option was a head-on collision course. He tightened his harness, aligned the Mustang's nose, and held steady. The German fighters sprayed tracers ahead of them, bright streaks crossing the sky like thrown sparks. Howard held the line until the last possible instant, then yanked the stick to the left. The Mustang snapped sideways. The FW-190S streaked past, barely missing him. Howard didn't pursue. Pursuit wasted energy. Instead he climbed again, forcing the Germans to spend their altitude advantage reacting to him. The bomber crews watched this impossible duel unfold, witnessing a single fighter intercept wave after wave of enemy attacks. Every moment Howard delayed the Germans meant another minute closer to the target, another chance for the bombers to survive the run. At that altitude, time did not move normally. Seconds felt heavy, drawn out, suspended in the thin air. Yet with each passing moment, the German fighters grew more aggressive. They realized the bombers were barely defended. The surge of attackers began to tighten again. Howard wiped frost from the inside of the canopy with his glove. His ammo was decreasing. His fuel gauge had dipped into a region that meant there would be no extended chase, no long return fight. But the German formations were not stopping. They were preparing for their next coordinated assault, larger, faster, closer. This was no longer the opening clash. This was the beginning of the real battle. The battle was no longer a sequence of individual clashes but a continuous storm of motion, metal, and instinct. The sky had turned into a shifting labyrinth, where every second demanded a choice, and every maneuver carved into a steadily shrinking reservoir of fuel and ammunition. Howard felt the weight of each decision like pressure behind his ribs. He understood, even without looking at the gauges, that the margin for risk was nearly gone. But the German fighters were not relenting. Their numbers seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon, fresh groups rising from below while others circled for altitude before diving back into the fray. The Luftwaffe had committed significant resources to defend the Oschersleben industrial zone that morning, aware that the bombers posed a direct threat to their remaining fighter production facilities. They were fighting with urgency, disciplined, coordinated, and in overwhelming strength. Howard rolled hard left as another formation of Bals 109 SIF swept in from above, their silhouettes sharp and angular against the pale sun. Tracers cut across the sky in long, thin chains, flashing like sparks against the cold air. One burst passed close enough to rattle the Mustang's canopy, the sound slicing through the engine's steady vibration. Howard felt the shock through the frame, an unmistakable reminder of how narrow his survival envelope had become. He pulled the Mustang into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude, knowing the German fighters would follow. They did. 3 of them. Their engines roared behind him, closing the gap with predatory precision. Howard kept the climb shallow enough to maintain maneuverability, yet steep enough to force the attackers into extended pursuit. He needed them committed, energy depleted, overextended. At the apex of the climb, the Mustang shuddered, nearly stalling. Howard pushed the stick forward, letting the aircraft fall into a controlled dive. The pressure flattened him into the seat as the cold, thin air rushed past the canopy. The German fighters reacted moments too late. Their climb had drained their energy. They slipped behind, unable to match the sudden drop. Howard pulled the trigger in a measured burst. Tracers laced across the sky. A Bals 109's fuel tank ruptured in a flash, sending the fighter spiraling downward in a plume of black smoke. The second attacker peeled away violently, its pilot choosing escape over further commitment. The third overshot, a split-second miscalculation that left him exposed for several seconds, long enough for Howard to cut across his path and fire another short burst that tore fabric from the wing and forced the German fighter to dive in retreat. 3 more threats neutralized, but at a cost. Howard checked his ammunition indicator. It was dropping fast, far faster than any escort mission could justify. He had already exceeded the firing time most pilots used for an entire day of combat, and the Germans were still pressing in waves. The fuel levels were even worse. The extended climbs, dives, and aggressive maneuvers had consumed precious reserves. He wouldn't be able to fight much longer. He wouldn't even be able to fly much longer. Below, the bomber formation continued its slow advance. The B-17s pushed through the upper air, maintaining formation despite the turbulence that shuddered through their wings. Inside each aircraft, gunners tracked the battle through thick glass, watching the lone Mustang cut through enemy fighters with a determination that bordered on impossible. Their intercoms crackled with disbelief as the battle unfolded. Mustang defending alone, he's still engaging, he's driving them off. He's still up there, still fighting. For the bomber crews, the sight became something almost unreal. They had seen escorts engaged before, but never like this. Never one against 30. Never one refusing to leave. Howard saw nothing except threats and geometry. A new cluster of FW-190s broke through the haze. Howard turned toward them immediately, knowing they were seconds from making a coordinated pass on the bombers. He raised the Mustang's nose and fired a short burst to break their formation. It worked. The Germans spread out to avoid direct engagement, hesitation that bought the bombers another 30 seconds of survival. 30 seconds that mattered. But the German pilots adapted. They recognized that the escort consisted of a single fighter, and began coordinating large-scale breaks to corner the Mustang. Howard saw the net tightening. They were attempting to trap him against the bomber boxes, forcing him into predictable paths where firing lines could intersect. The fight was entering its most dangerous phase. Two FW-190s dove at Howard simultaneously from opposite angles, a crisscross pattern meant to force him into evasive maneuvers that would expose his flank to a third attacker approaching from below. Howard rolled to meet the first, dropped beneath the second, and cut sharply right to avoid the third, but the maneuver bled precious energy. The Mustang trembled as its airspeed dipped. He leveled out too low. The next attack came instantly. A Balse 109 snapped into a tight turn and swept in behind him, its guns flashing. Rounds struck the Mustang's left wing, punching small holes near the trailing edge. The aircraft shook violently. Howard felt the tremor run through the controls. The Mustang had been hit, though not critically. But it was a sign of how close the battle had tilted. He pulled the aircraft into a wide sweeping climb, forcing the attacker into a longer turn radius. The German fighter tried to hold position but couldn't match the Mustang's grip on the air. Howard cut inside the turn and fired a burst that shredded the enemy's propeller arc. The fighter flipped away, falling into a spiraling descent. Another threat gone, but the Mustang was slowing. It was wounded, low on fuel, and nearly out of ammunition. The Germans were beginning to sense it. A new wave of fighters formed in the distance, larger than the previous ones, perhaps the final concentrated effort to break through to the bombers. Howard's breathing steadied, his gloves tightened around the throttle and stick. The frost on the canopy thickened around the edges, framing the battlefield in cold white haze. He had minutes left, perhaps less, but the German fighters had seconds before they reached the bombers. Howard made his choice. He angled the Mustang toward the oncoming wave. One man, one aircraft, almost out of options, committing to a final engagement with nothing left but instinct and resolve. The breaking point had arrived. When the final wave of German fighters surged forward, the sky had the look of a collapsing battlefield, contrails twisting in broken arcs, oil smoke drifting through the upper air, and the distant boom of engines laboring at their limits. The bomber formation pressed on, unaware that the escort above them was reaching the last few drops of its endurance. Howard kept climbing, the Merlin engine straining with each second of throttle. He had almost no ammunition left. Fuel was so low that the indicator needle trembled at the bottom of the gauge. The Mustang's left wing bore the scars of machine gun fire, small holes blackened around the edges by powder burn, but the German fighters were committed. They came in a staggered wave. First the FW-190s, then a flight of BAF-109s, all pushing for altitude to strike the bomber formation before it crossed the final leg toward the industrial complex. Howard watched them rise through the shimmering frost. He saw their angles, their timing, the line of their climb. He knew exactly when they would merge with the bombers. He also knew he could not let that happen. He advanced the throttle despite the engine's protest. the Mustang trembling under the strain. The airframe felt thin, the cold seeping into the cockpit, the vibrations merging into a low continuous hum. He kept his eyes locked on the lead fighters, their wings cutting through the haze with predatory intent. He had one burst of ammunition left, maybe 2 seconds of fire. Enough to disrupt, enough to force hesitation. He closed the distance. The first FW-190 banked toward the bombers. Howard angled in and fired a short, controlled burst, his last decisive use of ammunition. The tracers passed inches from the fighter's canopy, close enough to force the German pilot to break off and roll sharply away. The sudden maneuver unraveled the timing of the entire attack group. The fighters behind him hesitated, adjusting their vector, losing seconds of coordination, seconds the bombers desperately needed. Howard did not chase. He couldn't. Ammunition was nearly gone. Instead, he did what no pilot with a depleted aircraft should ever do. He kept charging directly at the next group of German fighters. They saw him coming. They knew he was out of ammunition. They knew the Mustang's aggression no longer made tactical sense, but they also knew that this single fighter had disrupted every attack wave they had launched. That uncertainty, bordering on disbelief, forced hesitation. A hesitation that saved lives. The German formation broke again, scattering to avoid the lone Mustang diving at them. Without synchronized timing, the attack on the bombers collapsed into smaller, isolated engagements that the remaining bomber gunners could repel. Some German fighters peeled off to regroup. Others dropped altitude to avoid overcommitting. A few continued toward the bombers, but without the massed force required to inflict devastating losses. The bombers pushed on, engines groaning, fuselages shuddering under the strain of cold altitude and fear. But they stayed intact. None fell from the formation during the window Howard held off the attackers. By the time the German fighters regrouped for a final attempt, the bomber stream had moved beyond optimal interception range. The opportunity had passed. Howard's job was done. Now he had to get home. He turned the Mustang west, the aircraft wobbling slightly as it transitioned out of its final maneuver. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. The engine sputtered once, a cough of exhaustion, before stabilizing at reduced power. Howard adjusted the mixture, preserving what little fuel remained. The cold air thinned further as he dropped altitude, the haze drifting upward like gray smoke rising from the ground. Behind him, the sky slowly quieted. For the bomber crews, the sense of disbelief lasted long after the German fighters had vanished. Gunners looked out through their blasted plexiglass blisters, scanning the sky where the Mustang had fought. Many had counted the enemies. Many had seen the lone fighter intercept wave after wave. They struggled to explain it. Some thought the Mustang belonged to a larger force they hadn't seen. Some believed reinforcements had arrived invisibly, but most simply stared at the frozen horizon, silent, processing what they had witnessed. When Howard finally reached base at RAF Boxted, he brought the Mustang down gently, the engine coughing as it idled on the ground. Crew chiefs ran to the aircraft, their eyes widening at the bullet holes in the wings. Howard climbed out slowly, fatigue settling into his limbs, frost clinging to his flight suit. He said little. His face carried the calm of someone who had focused so intensely on survival that emotion had not yet returned. Later, bomber crews began filing reports. They described what they saw in clear, understated language. A single P-51 defended the entire group. He held off 30 German fighters. He continued fighting after running out of ammunition. He refused to leave the bombers. Interviews with the crews confirmed the unbelievable scale of what Howard had done. Intelligence officers compiled the accounts, matching them with German interception logs and eyewitness testimonies. One conclusion emerged. Howard had performed the most extraordinary lone defense action of any fighter escort in the European Air War. The 8th Air Force Command began reviewing the mission. The testimonies aligned. The bomber-gunner observations matched. German losses, while difficult to confirm precisely, supported the claim that Howard had disrupted multiple attack waves long enough to ensure the bombers reached their objective with minimal losses. It was not simply an act of bravery, it was an act of singular consequence. Weeks later, when James Howard received the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force to be awarded it, his official citation echoed the quiet clarity of the moment. He single-handedly protected the bomber formation. He fought for 30 minutes. He continued to defend even after ammunition was exhausted. He would not turn away. History recorded the engagement as the defining example of American aerial determination, one man against overwhelming odds, choosing resolve over reason, precision over panic, duty over survival. The legacy of his stand endured not because of the number of aircraft he shot down, but because of the countless he saved. In the industrial haze over central Germany, on a cold January day when the sky threatened to collapse, James Howard had done what the air war almost never allowed. He changed the outcome alone, and the world remembered.